Welcome to today's Explainer. We're doing something a little bit different today. We are taking off our standard analytical hats and putting on the hats of international institutional investors. When capital allocators look at North America, their eyes almost instinctively lock right onto the United States. But right above it sits this highly advanced, first world economic powerhouse that honestly is way too often treated as a side thought. I'm talking, of course, about Canada. Today, we're going to look at Canada not as the US's much quieter sibling, but as a stealthy, independent economic engine with a truly unique DNA in the Western Hemisphere. For any serious investor, understanding exactly how this nation leverages its unique geography, its people, and its vast resources is absolutely crucial. Okay, let's dive into this. We've mapped out this high-level economic briefing into 5 key areas. We'll be looking at the geographic dividend, the human capital engine, the real estate risk factor, resource wealth and responsibility, and then we'll wrap it all up with the final investor verdict. Starting right off with Chapter 1, the geographic dividend. Now, to really understand the Canadian economy, you have to start with geography. Because in Canada's case, geography is literally financial destiny. And this brilliantly illustrates the dual reality of the Canadian landscape. On one hand, Canada is uniquely blessed, right? It has a direct land connection to the United States, which is the largest, most valuable consumer market in the entire world. Add to that direct access to both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans for incredibly lucrative trade with Europe and Asia. It's fantastic. But that exact same geography is also kind of a curse. A vast majority of the Canadian landmass is sparsely populated Arctic tundra. This extreme environment is where so many of its resources are actually located, which drastically increases the operational costs of extracting them compared to more temperate climates. So it's this constant tug of war between prime market access and a really hostile operational environment. But there is a massive, often completely overlooked financial benefit to Canada's location on the globe. Because Canada shares a border with a global superpower, and because, let's be real, nobody in their right mind is going to invade North America in the 21st century, Canada enjoys an incredible geopolitical shield. And that shield saves vast amounts of capital. To put this in perspective, comparable Commonwealth nations with way smaller land masses and populations, think Australia, they spend 50% more of their GDP on annual military defense. For us as investors, that is a huge metric. It means Canada possesses incredibly high capital efficiency, allowing funds that would normally get tied up in national defense to circulate elsewhere in the economy. That brings us to our second pillar, Chapter 2, the human capital engine. If geography is the foundation of the Canadian economy, while demographics and skilled migration are the accelerator pedals. Just look at this breakdown based on estimates from the United Nations. As of 2015, almost 22% of the Canadian population was represented by people not born in Canada. That includes a mix of permanent residents and foreign citizens on working or student visas. We're looking at this purely through an economic lens here. And statistically speaking, inviting skilled migrants into an economy is a proven direct lever for economic expansion. When an engineer from overseas moves to Canada, they don't arrive empty-handed. They bring capital with them, and they fill severely undermanned professions. Ultimately, they contribute significantly more to the economy than what they take out in a wage. But the equation gets even more favorable when we look at the education sector. As of 2017, estimates showed there were roughly 245,000 international students in secondary and tertiary education in Canada, and that number has just been steadily rising. From a purely economic standpoint, this demographic is an absolute powerhouse. Why? Because international students inject pure cash straight into the economic system. It might sound a bit unconventional at first, but think of education exactly like a physical export. Just like a shipping container leaving a port, education functions as a major, highly lucrative export commodity. Most of these international students receive a significant portion of their income from their home countries, usually from wealthy parents. They pay premium tuition into Canadian universities and spend heavily to fund their lifestyle while living there. In return, Canada educates them and sends a smarter student back home. Canada gets the capital injection, and the home country gets the educated citizen. It's a brilliantly effective economic engine. Moving on to Section 3, the real estate risk factor. However, every aggressive economic strategy has side effects, right? We have to impartially analyze the basic supply and demand realities of this massive capital and demographic influx. The most apparent flaw in the skilled migration strategy is the severe cost of living increase it triggers in major urban centers. Let's look at Vancouver as an example. With its legendary safety, natural beauty, proximity to the American West Coast, and its world-famous universities, Vancouver acts as a super magnet for wealthy migrants and international students. This intense localized demand has caused massive appreciation in property prices. So the crucial point is this. Average properties in the suburbs of Vancouver are easily selling for over 10 times the national average wage. 10 times. For many born and raised Canadians, this mathematical reality has made home ownership completely unattainable. The sheer amount of capital brought in by wealthy migrants is simply pricing local wage earners entirely out of the market. And this isn't just a localized frustration, it actually poses a very real structural risk to long-term prosperity. Because land taxes in these areas are based on inflated market values, we're seeing scenarios where retired residents might actually be pushed out of fully paid off homes simply because they can't afford the taxes on a property that is now worth 20 or 30 times its original purchase price. Economies with high instances of homeownership tend to be way more prosperous over the long term. If this overheating continues to starve Canada of that typical economic milestone, it could create significant headwinds for the broader economy down the line. Which brings us to our fourth pillar, resource wealth and responsibility. Canada is a famously resource-rich nation. But as we know as investors, having resources is only half the battle. How a government actually manages that wealth dictates the long-term stability of the market. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how Canada compares to its global peers on the wealth responsibility spectrum. Up on one end, you have Norway, which effectively nationalized its resource revenue into this massive investment fund for high citizen benefit. Then you've got Australia, which leaned heavily on private industry, but critics argue much of that wealth was essentially pilfered by mining companies rather than really benefiting the average citizen. Down at the bottom, you have the Democratic Republic of the Congo, incredibly rich in resources, but suffering from deep structural issues that keep citizens poor. Canada? Canada sits right in a very responsible middle ground. Instead of going for full nationalization or completely unchecked privatization, Canada uses a balanced system of federal and provincial mining taxes to responsibly return natural wealth back to its citizens. Well, actually, it applies to all provinces and territories except Prince Edward Island because, rather humorously, they simply don't have any mines. But for the rest of the country, this taxation model ensures that once finite materials are dug out of the ground and exported, a portion of that revenue is strictly secured for the future of the nation. It provides a really stable, predictable framework for institutional investors. Let's move to and see how this builds into real-world operational challenges, specifically looking at shale oil. Step 1. Canada identifies massive shale oil reserves. Step 2. Its safe, stable democracy and protection of free enterprise naturally attract investor interest. But here is the roadblock hitting right at Step 3. Extraction costs. Shale oil extraction is already an intense, costly industrial process. When you combine that with the harsh realities of the Canadian Arctic tundra we talked about earlier, profit margins get severely squeezed. The result in Step 4? Global capital just naturally flows to cheaper, less desolate oil fields in other countries. The resources are there and the political stability is there for sure, but those geographic extraction costs often make other global investments make a lot more economic sense. And that takes us to our final chapter, the final investor verdict. We've covered geography, demographics, real estate, and resources. So here's the bottom line for your portfolio. Canada offers an incredibly safe, high-yield democracy. It boasts unrivaled access to the U.S. consumer market and incredibly high capital efficiency because that geopolitical shield keeps defense spending low. Its aggressive human capital strategy and highly lucrative education exports are acting as massive economic growth levers. However, any solid investment thesis has to accurately price in the friction, the harsh geographic extraction costs that squeeze commodity margins, and those severe real estate bottlenecks in major hubs like Vancouver that genuinely threaten long-term homeownership stability. Canada is an undeniably vital, developed market, one that's continually working to balance its incredible blessings against its unique physical challenges. As you sit down to plan your next capital allocation, I want to leave you with this provocative final thought to weigh. As we look to the coming decades, will Canada's high-yield human capital and demographic engines continue to outpace its geographic and real estate hurdles? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep analyzing, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time.